Today we'll be looking at what was self-described as an amazing episode in the life of Jesus, and I've entitled this talk, Great Connections, and we'll be looking at Luke's Gospel, chapter 7, verses 1 to 10. One of the most common and perhaps overused words within religious circles is the word faith. Even though phrases like, have faith in God, keep the faith, you need more faith, we're saved by faith, not by works. Even though these kinds of phrases may be part of our vocabulary, if you're like me, we struggle to understand what faith really is. And I know I'm not alone in struggling to understand faith because people throughout the Bible struggled to understand faith. Despite our struggle to understand faith, the Bible emphasizes that faith is incredibly important because we can't connect with God apart from faith. Or as the letter to Hebrews states, without faith it is impossible to please God. And that's from Hebrews 11, verse 6. If faith is so critical, the big question for us is, how do we know if we have faith? Today we look at one of Jesus' encounters that ends with Jesus declaring that the man at the center of the encounter had the most faith of practically anyone he had met. In fact, this person is the only one in the Bible about whose faith Jesus was amazed. That assertion by Jesus begs us to take a close look in order to discover the secrets of what it was that made this person an amazing example of faith. Before we read this account, let's preview the characters within it. Apart from Jesus, the primary character in this encounter was a centurion. The title centurion suggests being in command of 100 soldiers, but in reality, centurion was probably more of a military rank, like a captain. The understanding we gain from the 7 different centurions who are mentioned in the New Testament is that they were the highest-ranking Roman official in charge of maintaining law and order within the communities to which they were assigned. Even though centurions represented the unwanted Roman occupying forces, it's interesting to note that the centurions mentioned in the Bible each appear to have been respected for carrying out their duties with fairness. The particular centurion in this story, however, managed to distinguish himself far above the respect other centurions achieved. In addition to the centurion, a completely unexpected group played a pivotal role in this episode. Jesus and his disciples were notorious for being in conflict with the Jewish religious leaders of the day. But on this occasion, Luke is careful to clarify that it was actually some elders of the Jews who acted as a liaison to connect the centurion with Jesus. These elders eagerly sought to convince Jesus that the centurion was worthy of his help. That's particularly surprising because just 3 chapters prior in Luke's Gospel, the religious leaders of the nearby community of Nazareth had wanted to execute Jesus. The third character of whom we need to take note was the centurion's servant. That the sick person in this account was not anyone's family member dramatically increases the impact of this episode. The servant was, in fact, a household slave. According to Aristotle, a slave was living property, and the slave's status was that of a thing. A slave was at the mercy of the absolute power of the master, to the point that a master could not be found guilty of murdering a slave. This particular slave situation was noteworthy because the centurion did not treat his slave servant the way the law allowed him to. These then are the unlikely characters in an encounter which would lead Jesus to proclaim that he had not found such great faith even in Israel. An officer of a foreign occupying military force, a group of Jewish elders who were sympathetic to the foreign officer, and a servant/slave who had no personal rights. Why was the centurion the only person mentioned in the Bible about whose faith Jesus was amazed? This is what happened according to Luke 7, verses 1 to 10. When Jesus had finished saying all this to the people who were listening, he entered Capernaum. There, a centurion's servant, whom his master valued highly, was ill and about to die. The centurion heard of Jesus and sent some elders of the Jews to him, asking him to come and heal his servant. When they came to Jesus, they pleaded earnestly with him, "This man deserves to have you do this, because he loves our nation and has built our synagogue." So Jesus went with them. He was not far from the house when the centurion sent friends to say to him, "Lord, don't trouble yourself, for I do not deserve to have you come under my roof. That is why I did not even consider myself worthy to come to you. But say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority with soldiers under me. I tell this one, 'Go,' and he goes, and that one, 'Come,' and he comes. I say to my servant, 'Do this,' and he does it." When Jesus heard this, he was amazed at him, and turning to the crowd following, he said, "I tell you, I have not found such great faith even in Israel." Then the men who had been sent returned to the house and found the servant well. Regardless of Jesus' declaration that he had not previously found such great faith, we immediately notice that there are elements missing which we assume should be present when we talk about faith. There is no mention of prayer. There is no mention of giving the right theological answers to penetrating questions. There is no mention that the centurion had abandoned the Roman and Greek gods. Instead, we are confronted with the unavoidable notion that relational connections are central to faith. The Romans as a whole were unwelcome in Palestine, and yet this centurion knew how to make the kind of connections which garnered him goodwill from the city of Capernaum. And it was apparently those kinds of connections which revealed the faith Jesus identified in him. How did the centurion's connections relate to faith? First, he treated people who were culturally different as his neighbors. Even though the centurion was in theory a Roman occupier, in practice he treated the Jewish people as his neighbors. Out of that sense of being neighborly, he had a brand new synagogue built as a place for the people of Capernaum to worship. He may even have attended worship in the synagogue, because the elders of the city proclaimed him to be a man who loves our nation. In turn, the people of Capernaum not only respected their centurion, they had uncharacteristically developed an affection, maybe even a love for him. We don't typically associate being neighborly as an expression of faith, but maybe it's more important than we often think. Being neighborly might not be the first evidence of faith that we look for, but it was certainly central to Jesus' story of the Good Samaritan. And the centurion was the kind of neighbor we all want. A second demonstration of the centurion's ability to build connections was that he cared about the socially deprived. There's a reason the centurion wanted his servant healed. In the beginning of the episode, the servant is referred to by the familiar Greek word doulos, which refers to a servant slave. Later on, though, in verse 7, when the centurion sent a message to Jesus asking him to not come to his house, but to merely say a word for the servant to be healed, he used a term of endearment in referring to the servant. The expression in the original language could be translated as my child. In a world where social hierarchy was carefully observed, it's noteworthy that the centurion treated his servant as his son. No wonder the centurion cared about the welfare of his servant. He was like a son. Again, we don't typically relate care for the socially deprived as an expression of faith. But we would do well to remember that Jesus liked to talk about the least of these. We should also remember that James, who was Jesus' biological brother, said that true religion is caring for orphans and widows. You can find that in James 1, verse 27. If we profess faith in God, who extends arms to deprived humanity, is it not logical that faith would inspire us to do the same? A third indication of the centurion's ability to make connections was that he was humble. We don't always view faith in the context of humility. Sometimes faith is presented as being demanding of God, of pressing God to respond to our wishes. People who are the most outspoken in their demands to God are sometimes thought of as having the most faith. But that was not the centurion. He viewed himself as undeserving, with no right to demand anything. Ironically, it was the Jewish elders who were bent on convincing Jesus that the centurion was entitled to Jesus' intervention because he was good to them. For his part, the centurion was just humble. He didn't even consider himself worthy of having Jesus enter his house. In simple terms, being humble means that we don't act entitled. We don't assume that God or people owe us. Jesus connected with that sincere humility as an expression of faith. It's true that there's a certain element of boldness to faith, but faith is always more about recognizing how undeserving we are and how grateful we are that God would actually notice us. That kind of humility results in trusting God with the outcome, which is exactly what the centurion did. We can't avoid the conclusion that Jesus' assessment of the centurion's faith being amazing was reflected in the positive connections he made within his community, with a socially deprived young man, and ultimately with Jesus himself. In essence, his faith was more about benefiting others than himself. We are often tempted to assume that faith is measured according to the level of piety achieved, along with the personal success that is experienced in life. The centurion amazed Jesus by demonstrating that the measure of his faith was reflected in the connections which brought improvement to the lives of people around him. It makes sense that my faith connections also ought to enable those around me to live richer lives. That leaves us with a challenging question in conclusion. Are people around me better off because of my personal faith connections?